there was not a Jewish person alive in the first century who thought that you earned your salvation, who thought you earned your way into grace. Hi, welcome to our channel here at Mundelein Church of the Nazarene and our ongoing series entitled The First Book. This is episode 10 as we're slowly making our way through the book of Galatians. Now, the reason why we're calling it the first book is chronologically Galatians is the first book to be written in the New Testament, about 48 AD. And before we kind of kick off this episode, I want to remind us of a very important fact. Remember, especially when we get to Paul's letters, sometimes the temptation is for us to just lift up the Bible and start to read and think that this is being written to us. It's not. It was written to a specific place at a specific time and to a specific group of people. So, everything we read in Galatians and Corinthians and Ephesians and other places is only half of the conversation. It's important for us to realize the other half of the conversation in order for us to properly take the right lessons from any scripture that we read. And this is maybe most specifically true in the book of Galatians, and especially when we get to this section. Last week we were in chapter 4, and we didn't really finish it. We kind of did. I want to start at the end of chapter 4. Paul is writing in verse 28, he says, "Now you, brothers, like Isaac, are children of promise. At that time, the son born in the ordinary way persecuted the son born by the power of the Spirit. And it is the same now." Now, I want us to remember what's going on. Paul went to Galatia, started a church, and many people enthusiastically believed, and the church started. Paul leaves, and after he leaves, some other people come after him and say, "Listen, Paul was a great guy, but he only told you half the story. Yes, faith is what activates our relationship with Jesus Christ. However, Paul stopped with Genesis 15. Abraham believed God. He didn't tell you about Genesis 17. Every male among you must be circumcised." And so eager were they to do everything right that some of the believers said, "I will voluntarily undergo adult circumcision." That was the issue. I'm not making it up. And other things as well. Have to keep food table laws, no pork, no shellfish. And so that was a condition of their acceptance or their full expression of Christianity, or so they believed. And Paul heard this, and he was upset by it. Because if you force Gentiles to keep kosher, if you force Gentiles to undergo circumcision as a religious requirement, you have just relegated Christianity into a narrow sect of Judaism. And Paul wanted everyone to be able to come to Christ on equal footing. And so that's where he finds it. He said, now, go back. We're in the world of Abraham and Isaac and Ishmael. Abraham had the promise, "I will bless all nations through you. You will have a son." Well, he was pretty old and his wife was pretty old. And he waited 12 years. And then Ishmael was born, not through his wife, but his wife, wanting her husband to have an heir, gave one of her servants. And as was the custom at the time, Abraham fathered a child through Hagar, and Ishmael was born. And then 12 years go by again, and finally Isaac is born. This is the son of the promise, the one that they've been waiting for. Abraham and Sarah now had a son that was promised to them by God. All of a sudden, Hagar and Ishmael felt a little left out. You have Ishmael, who's about 13, and he is taunting. He's making sport of the young son. It made Sarah mad, and so eventually Abraham had to get rid of Hagar and Ishmael. That is the basis of a lot of the still rivalry in the Middle East today. So that's what the text is referring to. The people then, Ishmael, the one who was circumcised as an adult, he was 13, is persecuting the son of the promise. Those of you who are listening to those who are saying you have to be circumcised, you have to avoid cheeseburgers, you have to avoid bacon, you have to keep kosher, you are doing the same thing that was happening then. So what happened? What does Scripture say? Get rid of the slave woman and her son, for the slave woman's son will never share in the inheritance with the free woman. Therefore, we're not children of the slave woman, but of the free woman. Paul is using an old Jewish story to illustrate where he is right now. When you think that you have to keep a rule book in order to get to Christ, you are acting like Ishmael, not like Isaac. You're willfully being a slave, not a servant. He moves on in chapter 5. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. Jumping to verse 3, Paul can't be more clear. I declare that everyone who lets himself be circumcised is obligated to obey the whole law. You who are trying to be justified by the law have been alienated from Christ and have fallen away from grace. This is strong language. If you go to the book of Corinthians, there's a lot of stuff going on. You have believers who are suing other believers. You have men who are going down to the temple dedicated to the god of erotic love who are worshiping with the temple prostitutes. You have women who are not touching their husbands. You have all kind of mess going on. Paul never stops calling them Christian. Here in Galatians, they are so zealous, so committed to the cause, that the men are volunteering as adults to run out and be circumcised to prove how zealous they are. And Paul states, you have fallen away from grace. Now, that's strong language because there's something at stake here. Let me tell you what's at stake. I think there's far more grace available to all of us than we care to realize. But as soon as we say that it's not about grace, it's about whether I've been circumcised or whether I keep kosher or whether I do any of these other things, then it has become more than just the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And it's no longer Christianity. You can be good, you can be moral, you can be religious, but as soon as it's about something else than the death and resurrection of Christ, it ceases to be Christian. So that's what's at stake. And so here's where most Christians misread Galatians. We think that Galatians is about legalism, about people who want to keep a rule book just to show what a good Christian they are. It's not about works. It's about grace. If you try to do good deeds, you're trying to earn your salvation through works. Let me say something very plainly. There was not a Jewish person alive in the first century who thought that you earned your salvation, who thought you earned your way into grace. They were God's people because God chose them. They didn't earn it. They kept the law to prove that they were part of that chosen class. So it wasn't about earning their way in. It was about keeping that status of God's people so they will stay in. It's a whole different thing than we think it is. So it's not a question of earning our way in. We do sometimes the same thing. Who are Christians? Well, Christians are people who, maybe they'll dress a certain way, or maybe they do certain things, or maybe they don't do a list of things, or they vote a certain way, or they don't vote that way, or they follow this person and don't follow that person. A Christian is someone who has put their faith, their entire trust of their very life into the hands of the risen Jesus Christ. That's it. Galatians is talking about status, not about earning your way through good works. This is not about the legalism that you think it is. It's about something far more basic. If you have to act a certain way, or dress a certain way, or vote a certain way in order to be a Christian, then God is only God of that narrow piece of the pie, those that look that way, vote that way, or act that way. And if God is only God of people who vote that way or look that way, then God is not God of the whole earth. And the issue for Paul is not legalism, it's the monotheism of God. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, of the entire world. One thing we all need to be reminded of, especially in these times today, is God of everyone. Every ethnicity, every nationality, every color, every voting bloc. And we need to stop this idea that everyone has to think like me or look like me in order to approach the throne. We're back to where we were when Paul was saying, listen to me, it's not just people who avoid pork that are God's people. It's bigger than that. That's the issue in Galatians. And whenever we start to go back to this idea that we have to keep a certain rule, we are burdened again by this yoke of slavery. That's what Paul is trying to get us to avoid. It's a message that's still fresh today. Hey, thanks for joining us. Come back next week. We're going to finish up chapter 5 and get to one of the most well-known passages of Scripture. I'd like you to subscribe to the channel, like us, but if you have a question, boy, please let us know. We'll be happy to cover it in a future video, but we'll be back here and see you again next week.